thank you all for coming out, and especially at such short notice. I know it was not announced early. Really appreciate you all showing up. I'd like to thank Jeff McAleer here, who's filming it for us and recording it. As soon as we know a link for you to go to see the recording, I'll let you know.
It'll be on my Patreon. I'm joking.
But as soon as I announced this talk on Facebook, all the Europeans lit up all the Warhammer groups saying, "You must record it." And so Jeff's making that happen, and thank you very much, Jeff. You'll also be able to find interviews he did with me and with Dom earlier in the day today. So this talk, I'm going to divide it roughly into three parts. First, I'm going to go back over the history of the Enemy Within campaign in the first edition, a few little inside jokes and stories and whatever else I can remember, and then bring it up to date with the Hogshead reprintings, and then the Enemy Within campaign that was published for third edition, and finally tell you what I can about the Enemy Within Director's Cut for 4th edition. And, you know, if Dawn rushes up and clamps a hand over my mouth, you'll know I've gone too far. And then finally, I'd like to just throw it open to questions, because I'm sure you have them, and WFRP wouldn't be what it is without you and people like you. The fans have kept it alive for 30 years during multiple publishers, long yawning gaps, and the community just refused to let it die. And I am amazed and humbled by that. So, we start off in the dark and dusty ages of 1986. Reagan, Thatcher, cruise missiles, and Graeme just out of college. I had written some stuff while at college for White Dwarf and also for Imagine, the TSR UK magazine, and become a regular contributor to both. And AD&D mostly, but a bunch of other stuff as well. And I got a call from Paul Coburn, who is the editor of Imagine, and then moved to Games Workshop and edited White Dwarf for a while. I'll have more to say about him later. But Brian Ansell had conceived the idea of a Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay game. Warhammer Battle at that time was in its second edition, which was the red box. And AD&D was going great guns. And Games Workshop had just lost its exclusive license to print and distribute AD&D materials in Europe. So they had their Warhammer property. They wanted to do a British game that would, in Brian Ansell's own words, stand toe-to-toe with AD&D. One problem, they were all wargamers. And although Warhammer in its early editions did have considerable role-playing elements, and the first edition box, the white box, had the strapline, the mass combat fantasy role-playing game. The main designers, apart from Brian, were Rick Priestley and Richard Halliwell, and they were wargamers, and they approached things in a wargamey kind of way. And this shows in the first edition rules, in the fact that all the skills are they're what you might call binary. You either have them or you don't. They don't scale, you can't advance them individually. And this derives from the wargaming rule convention of units having traits. And, but anyway, so they decided after a bit of work that they needed someone who had a record of writing for role-playing games to help them make this game. And because I've been very reliable for both, I was known both to White Dwarf and to TSR UK, and Paul Coburn recommended me. And I had a few meetings there. This would have been in about April of 1986. And I started work in May. June and July saw other people arrive from TSR UK, most notably Jim Bamborough, Phil Gallagher, who finished up the rule book with me and then took the lead on the Enemy Within campaign. I'll go into more detail on that later. And Mike Brunton, who was White Dwarf editor for quite a while, and then as last writer standing got the credit for completing the huge tentacled beast that was Realm of Chaos. And there are many stories about that. So, we got the rule book out just in time for Christmas 1986. We knew we needed adventures. Jim and Phil had just at TSR UK written a fantastic module called Night's Dark Terror. B10, also known as B/X1, which was to bridge between the basic and expert rules for D&D. Not AD&D, D&D, because they were still selling them as separate lines. And it was a campaign module. It laid out a huge area with lots of different plot hooks and encounters, and it's really one of the ancestors of the Enemy Within. Now, by the time they arrived, I'd already started writing an adventure called Shadows over Bogenhafen, which I thought was going to be a one-off module. Brian Ansell said to me, write me a bloodless Call of Cthulhu adventure for Warhammer, which is what I did. I started out, I knew the Warhammer mythos hadn't coalesced at that time. It was still a fairly loose generic fantasy mythos. The Chaos Gods were the most distinctive part of it. And so I decided to hook onto that. So Chaos Gods interact with mortals through demons. And my mind immediately went to Faust. I'd done a bit of amateur theatre before I got into role-playing. And I was quite hooked on the works of Christopher Marlowe and his play, Dr. Faustus. And it had always bothered me, because here's Faust, he sells his soul, he gets whatever he wants for 7 years, and then he knows he's going to hell afterwards. You know, who would sign a deal like that, really, unless they knew they were terminally ill, didn't actually have a soul? So I thought about this, and I thought about this, and I thought, okay, nobody's going to sign a deal like that unless there's a let-out clause. And so the let-out clause is you find 7 people to take your place in a sacrifice for your soul. And so I put that in, and then I thought, now wait a minute, demons are thousands of years old, and they need a huge level of base cunning just to survive. So a demon is going to outwit a mortal every single time. So then I put in the twist that while the Teugen, the Faust character, thought he was getting out of selling his soul, he'd actually been double-crossed and he was helping open a Chaos Gate. And anyway, so I was part way through writing that when, oh, another thing, Bogenhafen. Anybody here speak Swedish? Right. Bogenhafen in Reichsspiel, I intended to mean the port at the bend of the river. And it's actually sort of vaguely Germanish. It sort of works in German, as German players have assured me. And I stuck the umlaut over the O just out of caprice, you know, the way that Motorhead did. And, so 1988, I go to a game convention in Sweden, and somebody takes me aside and said, did you know that in Swedish, Bogen with the umlaut means gay? So instead of the port at the end of the river, at the bend of the river, Bogenhafen actually is the very gay port. Hello, sailor. And I said, well, that's very interesting, but that's not at all what it means in Reichsspiel, which are completely made up by me. So there. Anyway, so Jim and Phil started planning the campaign, and since Shadows over Bogenhafen was already underway, and it made sense to focus on the campaign rather than having some products that were and some that weren't, they wrote it into the main plot line as episode 2. They wrote The Enemy Within, all the source material, the Mistaken Identity adventure building up to Shadows over Bogenhafen. And those two came out fairly close together in module format. I don't know if any of you ever saw the first printings, but there was a little, very flimsy wraparound card cover, booklets and handouts inside, you know. Classic module format from the 70s and early 80s. And of course, in the average gaming store on the shelves, being fingered and poured and looked at, these things had a shelf lifespan of seconds. So very quickly in the second printing they got combined into the hardback book Warhammer Adventure. But anyway, so let me think. The Enemy Within, that's right, and then Shadows over Bogenhafen, and they were combined, and not much there in the way of in-jokes and stuff. We were kind of too busy just getting the things finished. The Gambler in Mistaken Identity in the Coaching Inn, Philippe Descartes, obviously his name means card games because he's a gambler. But also the French publisher of WFRP in the first edition was a company called Jeux Descartes, which actually means card games in French, but their logo was a picture of the philosopher René Descartes, so they were doing a pun in their own language. So, you know, they got it somehow. And anything else about Shadows over Bogenhafen? The illustrations were done by a new artist, one of John Blanche's discoveries, by the name of Will Rees. He was a very willowy, blonde, long-haired young man with an otherworldly expression. Looked like he'd stepped out of some sort of gothic romance. And he did this fantastically detailed cross-hatching. I have no idea how long it took him to finish a picture. But beside from Shadows over Bogenhafen and I think the 40k Rogue Trader rulebook, he didn't do much else for Games Workshop, possibly because he did take too long. And there are some gags in there, the names of the merchant companies in the merchant families in Bogenhafen. Teugen obviously is a pun on Teufel, German for devil. A little bit of a clue for... Oh, by the way, the names. We never anticipated at all that anyone whose native language was not English would ever read anything for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. I mean, we never read Der Schwarze Auge in German. We couldn't. Drachog Dämoner in Swedish, forget it. And so when we started getting letters from Germany, and someone even sent us a postcard from Altdorf, believe it or not. Großhaus Altdorf, what? And so they started commenting on the names and began a dialogue that carries on to this day. But they were originally intended just to sound vaguely Germanish, and if you happen to have done a couple of years of German in high school and know what they meant, then you'd feel clever, you'd like the product more, you'd get our in-joke, and, you know, no harm, no foul. But it got a little bit out of control, and one of the Hogshead products, I remember, had a demon who was named Zahnarzt, which is German for dentist. You know, what does everyone fear? Well, you're American, you don't fear dentists. Your dentists are brilliant. But anyway. So, back to the merchant families in Bogenhafen. Teugen, Teufel, Rupbroder, actually is derived from Danish. I'd gone on as an archaeology student to Denmark on a field trip, and they had this kind of pumpernickel type thing they called Rupbrot, which I guess means rye bread. Anyway, I just shoved that in there. Steinheger, same trip, on the ferry back, I picked up this very nice German gin by the name of Echter Steinheger, and apparently it's brewed in a town called Steinhagen. And what else? Oh, Magirius. There were large German-built trucks, 18-wheelers, in Britain at the time, with this logo of a rocket ship and the name Magirius Deutz. And Magirius just struck me as a perfect blend of German and Latin that would fit very well in that sort of Renaissance German setting. So that's where they came from. Or make of that what you will. so I finished writing Shadows over Bogenhof, and Jim and Phil finished writing Death on the Right Mistaken Identity. They were used to working very close together and always had at TSR, whereas I was more used to working alone as a freelancer. So that's how we divided things up, and then we switched and we edited and developed each other's work. Come Death on the Reich, Jim and Phil provided the bulk of the adventure, and I concentrated on writing the River Life of the Empire book. And then again we switched and edited and developed each other's work. Now Death on the Reich originally came out in a box because it was a lot fatter than the first two, and because we realised that the module format was just going to have too much wastage in shopware. Unfortunately, the box was not a lot better. It was very, very flimsy, low-grade card to make it meet the price point, and you don't see very many of them at all on sale today on the auction sites. So that too very quickly became hardback. We had a new artist for Death on the Reich, a guy called Martin McKenna, who's gone on to very great things. At the time, he worked mainly from photographs. And in Death on the Reich, you'll see a lot of actors. In Altdorf, the Purple Hand cultists who accost the player characters are, of course, Vincent Price and Peter Lorre. Ironically, I'd named them Lorbeer and Kuhn, which is German for Laurel and Hardy, but I guess, Martin didn't speak enough German to pick up on that, and I didn't do the art brief. There are various others, Graf Orlok, the vampire in the River Life of the Empire adventure, named after the character from Nosferatu, but ended up looking like Bela Lugosi. Then it got a lot quite fun in Castle Wittgenstein with the villagers and the castle's inhabitants. One of the sort of idiotic mutants was based on a picture of Charlie Elliott, who was Games Workshop's graphic designer for that line. He went on to quite a nice career with Wizards of the Coast and Top Deck and various others. Upper Deck, the card game. Anyway, and so there are a few little gags in there. If any of you have access to the old Warpstone magazine, I did a short article called Secrets of the Warhammer Artist. If I remember correctly, it was in issue number 6, where I go into a lot of the in-jokes and stuff that was hidden in the art. So anyway, Death on the Reich, the campaign was steaming along nicely. It was going exactly to plan. And the next instalment, Power Behind the Throne, was written by Carl Sargent. It was the first to be written by someone other than the core team of Jim, Phil and me. And my memory fails me. I thought I knew where it came from, but I now have heard two different stories when I tried to confirm this. Carl Sargent originally was a Cambridge academic. He studied psychology and parapsychology, making him the Peter Venkman of gaming. And he had a gaming group which included a lot of the staff from TSR UK, including Paul Coburn, Jim and Phil. And so he was well known to everybody by that time, and he moved to Nottingham when they did to carry on as a freelancer for Games Workshop. Now, this adventure of his, I always thought, was called Intrigue in Illyria and was part of his D&D campaign. But I've since heard that, well, nobody else remembers it that way, but there's a possibility it was something he pitched to a magazine called GM Publications, which was a one-man show that Paul Coburn ran after Imagine magazine folded and before he joined Games Workshop. And it ran for about 5 issues for over about a year. Anyway, doesn't matter. Carl came up with this brilliant concept for a really complex city-based adventure with loads of social interaction and political intrigue and a complete minefield of, the one NPC you needed was the one that you thought was the villain in the beginning, and you had so many opportunities to shoot yourself in the foot. and it is just amazingly beautifully concepted. It took a great deal of development to make it more accessible because of its complexity and the number of NPCs involved. That was done by a freelancer called Derek Norton, who later joined the staff briefly and had a few things to do with not only Power Behind the Throne, but I think the concept for Doomstones 5 and a couple of other Warhammer things outside of the Enemy Within campaign. Now, as we were developing Power Behind the Throne, it quickly became apparent that the amount of information you needed on the city of Middenheim was vast. And this section just grew and grew and grew until it became obvious that it had to become its own book. Not that we needed a great deal of persuading, because TSR had just published the Lankmar City Pack for AD&D, which was groundbreaking at the time, and which we all loved and longed to imitate. And a little earlier than that, I forget whether it was Chaosium or one of the other companies had published a box set based on the Thieves' World novels of Lynn Asprin and others, which was the first big city pack to hit. If you don't count Judges Guild's City State of the Invincible Overlord, which was very embryonic in that respect. Anyway, so we had the chance to do a city book, and we did. And the result was Middenheim, City of the White Wolf, and that became, our standard for cities. And that was a real team effort. Almost everybody in the studio contributed something or other to it. Sean Masterson, the White Dwarf editor, wrote The Adventure of the Lich Gürtelrose. I contributed a lot of the sort of random encounters in crowds and stuff, and Phil Gallagher, I think, excised most of the town stuff from the Power Behind the Throne manuscript, and padded that out. And a lot of gags in that. Carl had a really... he was a martyr to his sense of humour, and he was never quite sure where the line was. So we have things like the Showboat, I think was the name of the club. It was very decadent. Oh, Decadence and Deviance, a society of bon vivants, also known as D&Ders. But the Showboat was run by gorgeous George Michael, back in his Wham days before he became more serious, and had all sorts of cocktails, including the Hush Puppy, which was drunk from the skin of a small dog. And we should have stopped him. But so after Power Behind the Throne, all of these things received rave reviews all across the gaming media. The people who played them loved them. I'm sure there are some of them among you. But a month after WFRP 1 came out, 40k Rogue Trader came out. And the higher-ups, looking at the profit and loss sheets, saw a lot more money coming from 40k Rogue Trader because of the miniature sales and everything. And this was the beginning of the end for WFRP 1 in Games Workshop. Those of you who have seen the module format Enemy Within and Shadows over Bogenhafen and the box set of Death on the Reich may have seen insert sheets with miniatures deals for them. I always thought that was odd. I thought it was odd at the time, because what role player will spend $100, $150 more on miniatures for one scenario? But they were counting on the secondary miniature sales, and when those didn't materialize, because they didn't really understand the nature of role-playing games, that led to a perception of WFRP as being less profitable and of resources being better placed elsewhere. So there was a bit of a hiatus. One effort was made. A writer named Ken Ralston became available. He's best known today for his work on Neverwinter Nights, I think it was, the computer game. But at the time, he was a role-playing writer. He'd worked on Paranoia, the science fiction comedy game, the Ghostbusters role-playing game. He'd done a heap of stuff for RuneQuest and various incarnations of D&D, and he was a fairly significant name. And Games Workshop brought him over to work in the studio for a number of months on an adventure, and what he came up with was Something Rotten in Kislev. And I finished it, and he wasn't really au fait with the rules, so I handled all of that stuff in development and smoothed out enough to where Games Workshop saw fit to give me a co-author credit. Now, it was a fine adventure in and of itself. It didn't really have the spirit of the Enemy Within, but it had a lot of interesting stuff in it. And but the decision was made at a high level that we put the Enemy Within logo on it so that people will buy it who are already hooked on the campaign. And, you know, it makes commercial sense, or it did at the time, but it wasn't part of the original plan. Then it became harder and harder to get a green light for a Woodford product in Games Workshop. I got diverted onto helping develop Adeptus Titanicus and Dark Future and various other games. And there was a period of about a year where not a whole lot happened. And but then, as a final last-ditch effort to make Woodford make commercial sense to Games Workshop, Flame Publications was started, and it was a stripped-down operation, 3 people. Mike Brunton was running it and doing layout. I was doing editing and development, and Tony Ackland was doing the art, with free reign of all the archive of Games Workshop Warhammer art to choose from as well. And our job was every month or every 2 months, I forget, I think it was every month, to have a book finished and ready for press, and also to provide 8 pages a month for White Dwarf, which is how we got started on the Marienburg project. And we did that. One of our first jobs was to do Empire in Flames. Just get it finished, get it out the door, close out that campaign, stop people clamoring for it, because it had been promised years previously. And so that's what we did. Carl Sargent was hired to write it, and he wrote it very, very quickly. Mike Brunton developed it very, very quickly, while Flame was still kind of finding its feet, and I was working on what would become the Doomstones campaign. And it was then sent over to Games Workshop and printed and put out under their imprint to close out the Enemy Within campaign, and thenceforth everything for Woodford had the Flame logo. So that's the history of the Enemy Within campaign for first edition in Games Workshop. In the 90s, Hogshead Publishing got the license, and they reprinted everything up till Something Rotten in Kislev. Straight reprints, but still very well received. The campaign, I should backtrack and say that a French magazine called Casus Belli voted the Enemy Within campaign the best role-playing game of all time, a title which they bestowed on us jointly with the Call of Cthulhu campaign, Masks of Nyarlathotep. Yeah, people loved it. The Enemy Within became a magic name, and so there was still a market for it when Hogshead did their reprints. They went up to Something Rotten in Kislev. James Wallace, the head of Hogshead, never liked Empire in Flames, and many people found it unsatisfying, and he planned to do a complete ground-up rewrite, an all-new finale for the campaign under the working title Empire in Chaos. Alas, owing to several different factors, that never came to pass. There was a fan-written finale, which you can find on the web, called Empire at War, which a lot of people like, which I actually haven't read in any depth. And that really closes out the history of the first edition Enemy Within campaign. Now, later on, second edition came and went and had its own campaign, Paths of the Damned, for which I wrote the first volume and the little intro adventure in the rulebook, and I'm really not sure how it went after that. But then, excuse me. Then we had third edition, Fantasy Flight Edition, and Jay Little, the developer, contacted me with the idea of putting out an Enemy Within campaign for third edition. Now, this wasn't going to be a reprint or an updating of the original campaign, but it was going to take the themes and the values of the original Enemy Within campaign and do something all new for third edition following that model. And I was teamed up with another writer called Dave Allen, a very good guy, very capable writer, and we alternated on the 4 sections of the book. So he did 1 and 3, I did 2 and 4. It was a different sort of a campaign, not just in terms of game mechanics, but because the enemy within was more literally an enemy. There was one bad guy. They had a brilliant mechanic where it could be one of a number of different NPCs, and the GM could decide that and could switch it if the players caught on too early and he wanted to mess with them. Anyway, it was just this one guy who had this great conspiracy, far-reaching conspiracy, and it was just one book instead of 5 or 6 as the original was. And obviously the magic name of the Enemy Within, and I guess maybe my name as well being associated with the project, caused a great deal of excitement. They did a bang-up production job, as they did on all of their stuff. And I honestly haven't heard whether people liked it or not. People tend to say they like or dislike third edition as a whole without mentioning particular products or adventures. But so, yeah, that was another Enemy Within. Now, last year, when Cubicle 7 announced that they were going to do a 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, I got in touch with Dom, and we've been corresponded sporadically about other projects down the years, and declared my interest, and we talked a little, and Dom said, why don't you do an Enemy Within director's cut? And I don't think I've heard such welcome words in all my born days, because Cubicle 7 is marvellously giving me a free hand to make the campaign that Jim, Phil and I had in mind from the beginning. I've since been in touch with Phil. I've lost contact with Jim, sadly, but and he was probably a little too peeved with Games Workshop when he left to be interested in talking about it anymore. He's done quite well for himself in computer games, and probably regards his Games Workshop days as an episode that came to an end. Phil is no longer in the industry, but I did see him at an Old Hammer event in Maryland in 2014, I believe it was. And we caught up, and after that I picked his brain a little about the plans for the Enemy Within, because I have to admit here, I'm doing this because I'm the last writer standing. Jim and Phil were the driving force and the visionaries behind the whole campaign arc. I had an idea of what it was, but at the time I was too raw and green, and they were far more experienced than I was, and they knew more of what they were doing. So I spoke to Phil and picked his brain and got what he remembered of the original plan for the campaign. and put that together with what I remembered, and then filled in the gaps. So right now, I am halfway through the first draft of Volume 4. The rewrites on Volumes 1 through 3 are going to be fairly extensive. I don't want to create any sort of false hope or expectation, because that's going to take time, because the rulebook wasn't finalised until fairly recently. So there's going to be work to do there. But can I say what the volumes are?
Yeah.
All right. So it's going to be 5 volumes, 160 per, so that's 800 pages total. First one is going to be Enemy and Shadows. Second one, Death on the Reich. Third one, Power Behind the Throne. Fourth one, not Something Rotten in Kislev, but The Horned Rat. Anybody remember an announcement for a book called The Horned Rat?
Yeah.
And that was always going to be the 4th installment. And I put together what Phil remembers and what I remember, and so we're going to have some fun with that. And the 5th installment will be a ground-up rewrite of Empire in Flames, probably called Empire in something else. You know, probably not Empire in Organic Fertilizer, but anyway, to fulfill all of our intentions and all of everybody's expectations, and really sort of bridge things into the starting point in the Imperial timeline for Cubicle 7's other products. And along the way, I'm taking the opportunity to incorporate not only 30 years of fan feedback, but also some of the opportunities afforded by the new mechanics and the new edition, and to also have a little fun with those cocky players who may think they know it all because they played it before. So if you think you know who the bad guy is, and you have your character act accordingly, be prepared for embarrassment, pain and humiliation, because I will equip your GM to do that to you. And so there you have it. That's the Enemy Within, up to date, up to the present. Well, I suppose this is a good time to throw it open to questions, because I've run out of stuff to say. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Daniel.
Hi,
I had
Daniel.
a question about Enemy Within 3rd edition. So
Yep.
I know 3rd edition's like heresy, but we loved it. The way I'm running it, the adventure is so amazing. Is there a plan to tie the 3rd edition of Enemy Within back to the new version of the Enemy Within?
I think the answer to that is you're going to have to wait and see. I have to be very careful with spoilers, as I also have to be careful with promises. But I think, you know, whichever edition you prefer, whichever edition of the campaign, whichever edition of the game, you're going to find a lot to like in 4th edition. I wanted it. My fondest ambition for the 4th edition rules was that it would end the edition wars. It would be something that not necessarily was all things to all people, because that sounds watered down and smacks of compromise, but that it captured the common essence of Warhammer and satisfied everybody. And so far, I have to say, the response on the Cubicle 7 booth from people who stopped by, we've had people saying, oh, I only play 1st edition, everything else is trash, and they've said the same thing about 2nd and about 3rd. But no matter what their preference, they've all been very positive about the preview book we've got out. And so I'm very hopeful that the community can kind of come back together and fight chaos, not each other. And I have to say, as I've said before, 30 years with all the stops and starts and gaps and hiatuses and blind alleys and all the rest, it would satisfy me immensely to be able to give that back to the fans who've kept Warhammer alive against considerable odds for all this time. Any other questions?
How many more series do you hope to hit? Sorry. how many more adventures do you think you can envision coming to us?
Well, in practical terms, that's a question for myself. I could go on forever and ever until somebody stops me. I will mention one thing that I was just told today I'm allowed to mention. Does anybody remember from White Dwarf or from The Restless Dead? It's been reprinted. Apocrypha Now, Plundered Vaults, an adventure called A Rough Night with the Three Feathers. All right, so I wrote that as a kind of an experiment. I wasn't even sure it would work, and it succeeded beyond my wildest expectations. Basically, I was too lazy to pick a single plot, so I just did all of them. And over the years, I've revisited that format twice. There was an adventure called Nastasia's Wedding, which appeared in Pyramid magazine, dual statted for GURPS. And the third edition adventure, Edge of Night, which I did, included a sequence with a masquerade ball that was done in a similar style. I've put those together. I've added another adventure, and the mini campaign is going to be called Rough Nights and Hard Days. And I've seen the cover art already, and it's amazing. So if you remember at the end of The Three Feathers, one of the player characters has replaced the judicial champion for Graven Maria Ulrika, whose name, Bruno Franke, was a pun on the then famous British boxer Frank Bruno, in case anybody cares. So you're in service, you get to go to the trial and be the champion and counter various shenanigans that take place there. You get then to go to a society wedding where various farcical things happen, and finally to a masquerade ball that's full with political import. And it's hopefully a satisfying little mini campaign with 4 parts all done in the same style. And as for other things, Dom and I, and also Andy Law, who sadly couldn't be here today, but he's the lead developer. I've been dealing with him a lot, and he is a frightening fount of Warhammer knowledge. From every possible edition, every possible book, every possible source, the novels, the comics, everything. So we've been talking and kicking around various ideas, none of which I think are right for revelation just yet. But keep an eye on the Cubicle 7 blog. Unlike many companies, they are very, very good at keeping it updated with the latest, so you'll know as soon as we know. Yeah.
So when the original Enemy Within, there were a lot of sort of peripheral materials, which I'm kind of hearing you say there was a pressured stamp into Enemy Within, but the way it happened, there was Grapes of Wrath, and there were the other things that ended up in The Restless Dead.
Yeah.
Has there been any thought of, if this is like the director's cut, will there be like the director's cut DVD extras, which would be like revisiting some of those like optional side things in a new incarnation? Because there were a lot of those, like little short things you could use to extend the campaign.
The working title, which I'm sure will not be allowed to be final, is The Enemy Within 12-inch Extended Dance Mix, which I thought was suitably 80s. But yes, there are going to be companion volumes with peripheral materials. Some will be built in. You mentioned the Grapes of Wrath, and I should also mention Carry On Up the Reich from the Hogshead edition of Power Behind the Throne. And both of those were written because there was an uncomfortable gap in power between the end of Death on the Reich and the beginning of Power Behind the Throne. And we wanted to give the player characters a chance to level up a bit more. So some of that peripheral material that you mentioned will be included in the main campaign books if it helps the campaign work better. And the more optional DVD extra stuff will be included in the companion/dance mix volumes. And now, this touches on an interesting point, because one of the initial philosophical points of the Enemy Within was that modules, as they stood in 1986, were sort of run once and forget. They weren't any use after your players had gone through them. And that's why the Enemy Within has all the background stuff on the Empire. Shadows over Bokenhafen has the town itself, that sandbox. The Middenheim thing became a separate book. Death on the Reich has the river life, and so on. It was a point of policy to make sure that every installment in the Enemy Within campaign had material that would be useful beyond the playing of the adventure material. And that's something that I'm perpetuating. So there will be source material within the adventures, and there will be more peripheral material, not just reprints. There's going to be, I forget now, is it like 30-40% original, or nearer 50 now for the companion volumes? It's something like that, but there's going to be new stuff. There's going to be reprints of the favourite stuff from the old days as well. So the answer to your question is yes.
So you're hoping to incorporate stuff like trade, and basically you enter the field of a merchant, you have a means of using a system that exploits that type of background behavior. And I'm having the chance to do something that I wanted to do ever since Death on the Reich, and I never got the chance to do, and I proposed about 5 times within Games Workshop, which was road life of the Empire. You know, all the stagecoaches and different types of road traffic and encounters, and more enhanced mechanics for that. And a bunch of other stuff that I think it's a little premature to discuss, but yeah, there's going to be a mix of old and new, and every volume will have not just adventure material, but supplemental material that will be useful on an ongoing basis. Yeah.
Graeme, as far as everyone in the room here, they certainly have great love for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, regardless of version, or I'm sure they have their favorites. But there are going to be people who are going to see this video who might be stumbling upon 4th edition and Warhammer. Could be new. I mean, there are people who live under rocks. These people love the setting.
Yeah.
You obviously love the setting because you've been with every version of it, including the upcoming 4th. What is it about the setting that keeps drawing you back in?
Wow. What a
Besides the paycheck, I mean, you know, honestly.
That's a great question. And
I'm a journalist, man.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah. It's just a tremendously rich setting, multi-layered and multi-dimensional. When we first created Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay back in 1986, we included into the design, we worked out a lot of our frustrations with AD&D, which at the time had a very black and white morality, had kind of a Hollywood visual approach, like the heroes were all bodybuilders with chrome-plated armor, masses of backcombed blonde hair and perfect teeth, and they went around righting wrongs, and I suppose being British at the time, and you know, 10 years post-punk and a little bit anarchic, and so on. We wanted to portray the other side of the coin. We'd grown up with Monty Python and Terry Gilliam, Jabberwocky, the Holy Grail, and we found it ever so funny when the pretension of characters like those got punctured in an embarrassing and humiliating way. And you know, we also saw. Now here's a weird coincidence. I'm an archaeology graduate. Rick Priestley was an archaeology graduate. Nigel Stillman, who did Britannia's an archaeology graduate. And so I guess there's something about, first we had a sort of a more realistic idea of medieval life, and there's also something deeply attractive to a recovering archaeologist, as I style myself, about mud and filth. And so we incorporated all of that, and it's so instead of being an adventurer, a brave adventurer able to leap tall buildings with a single bound, which you probably can do in Age of Sigmar, you're at the bottom of the heap. You're trying to make your way in a society where luck has deserted you and society is against you. Even if you're a noble, society is against you because, you've got all this prestige and so on, and you're probably rich, but you don't know how to do anything because you've got servants for that. So it has that much more dimensionality and challenge. We have the Chaos Gods and the dark, deep psychological horror, which was inspired by Call of Cthulhu, was very new at the time when WFRP came out first time. And so there's that blend of adventuring and investigation. And but to leaven the cosmic existential horror, there's this slapstick humour, pitched at a sort of an 8-year-old level, usually involving organic fertilizer. And I take some responsibility for that because I designed the sewer system of Bogenhafen, and I had no idea it would become such an iconic theme of Warhammer. So if that appeals to you as a role player and as a world to explore, then check out Warhammer 4th edition, or indeed any edition, and
alignments
see if
be
you like
damned,
it.
right?
So if no one has anyone else, we are actually 5 minutes past time. So apologies to you who just came in, and thank you very much for.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again for watching The Daily Dope, presented by The Gaming Gang. If you like this episode, be sure to give it a quick thumbs up. And if you dig the channel, please subscribe. If you'd like to check out our previous episode, click right here. And if you want to check out a somewhat randomly selected episode, give a click right down here. It'll be like opening a box of Cracker Jacks. You just don't know what you'll get. Once again, thanks for watching, and I'm Jeff McAleer.